Thousands of people have died in the storm here recently. Thousands, not hundreds.
For decades, Eustace Conway, the real-life mountain man from Mountain Men and the founder of Turtle Island Preserve, was seen as the person who proved humans could still live with the land, not on top of it. But behind the cabins, the TV cameras, and the legend, he was hiding something.
That's an interesting question because we're not really open to the public. In fact, I think that's one of the pivotal things. You know, the health department says they're protecting public health and safety.
Secret journals locked away. Forbidden areas no one was allowed to enter.
And so your boat would suspend right here from a cross member.
And tragedies he never spoke about. In 2024, he finally revealed the truth he'd been protecting for 20 years.
This is the tunnel.
Yes.
Oh my God, look at this place.
The question is, why now? The paradise that nearly collapsed, Turtle Island's hidden crisis. Eustace Conway spent decades proving humans could live differently. Since 1987, he had been running Turtle Island Preserve, a 1,000-acre education center in the Blue Ridge Mountains, where he taught primitive living skills and self-sufficiency. He had crossed America on horseback, hiked the entire Appalachian Trail as a teenager, and lived completely off the land using skills most people had forgotten existed. His hand-built structures showed what was possible when humans worked with the land instead of against it. But for 40 years, Conway had been keeping something to himself, the real reason behind it all. And on one cold January morning, he was finally ready to reveal what had driven him into the wilderness in the first place. It all came to a head when government inspectors arrived at his gate one morning in 2012. They came with clipboards and measuring tapes, examining his cabins like crime scenes. The buildings had weathered decades of mountain storms and taught thousands what life looked like before electricity. To the state of North Carolina, they were violations. The notices came relentlessly. Each envelope brought another broken code, another fine pushing him toward bankruptcy. His outdoor kitchen, where students learned to cook over open flames, became a fire hazard. Traditional shelters built with techniques older than America itself were suddenly unsafe for human habitation. Officials demanded modern electrical systems in buildings designed to demonstrate life without them. They wanted septic tanks, where Conway taught about composting toilets that returned nutrients to the soil. The inspectors couldn't measure what those structures actually meant. Conway had chosen every log himself, walking his 1,000 acres until he found trees that had fallen naturally or needed thinning. The main lodge took 3 years to complete, built mostly alone with traditional tools that required skill instead of fuel. Students arrived expecting Hollywood wilderness and found buildings that breathed with the seasons. Floors worn smooth by decades of bare feet, windows placed to frame first light. The state's ultimatum wasn't really a choice. Modernize everything or shut down the educational programs that gave Turtle Island meaning. Conway had survived winters in a teepee and crossed the country on horseback, but Bureaucracy was a wilderness where his skills counted for nothing. Friends who visited said he looked like a man watching his child die. He'd sit by the fire pit where he'd taught thousands about flame as humanity's first tool, staring into coals without speaking. Some nights he walked his land until dawn, memorizing every tree. The money disappeared first, then the legal options. Conway, who'd never asked anyone for anything, accepted donations from strangers who'd seen him on Mountain Men. The irony cut deeper than any winter cold. A man teaching self-sufficiency, forced to depend on others because he'd built the way humans had built for thousands of years. The battle that broke him, when freedom became illegal. The fines arrived like clockwork. Every Monday morning, another violation notice would appear in Conway's mailbox at the bottom of his mountain road. $20,000 for unpermitted structures, $15,000 for improper sanitation, $10,000 for electrical code violations in buildings that had never seen a wire. By the time the leaves turned that fall, he owed more money than he'd spent in 20 years of living. Conway's lawyers told him to fight it publicly. Get on television, they said, rally supporters, start a petition. But Conway chose a different path. He went quiet. Not because he was weak, but because he understood something his lawyers didn't. The moment he turned his life into a spectacle, He'd already lost. The wilderness had taught him that the loudest animal is usually the most afraid. Instead, he did what he'd always done when faced with impossible odds. He retreated into the forest and studied his enemy. Every night, by lantern light, he read through building codes written by people who'd never split a log or mortared a stone. He learned their language, their logic, their fears. The regulations weren't really about safety. They were about control, about a system so terrified of liability that it had forgotten what real danger looked like. The emotional toll showed in ways only those closest to him could see. His hands, usually steady enough to skin a deer in darkness, began to shake when opening legal documents. He stopped singing the old mountain songs he'd learned from Cherokee elders. The man who could track a mouse through fallen leaves couldn't sleep because of the sound of imaginary bulldozers. One night, his closest friend found him standing at the edge of his property, staring at lights from the town below. Conway spoke without turning around, saying they wanted him to put exit signs in a cabin with one door. They wanted him to install smoke detectors in buildings where they taught people to smell smoke from a mile away. His voice carried no anger, just exhaustion. He told his friend he wasn't fighting for himself anymore, but for the right to live the truth. The papers to sell Turtle Island sat on his table for 3 days. A developer had offered enough to pay all the fines and leave Conway with money to disappear. He could buy land deeper in the mountains, somewhere beyond the reach of codes and inspectors. Start over, live free. All he had to do was sign. But on the third night, something shifted. Maybe it was the screech owl that called from the oak tree his grandfather had planted. Maybe it was finding his old journal from when he first bought the land, full of dreams about teaching children to remember what their ancestors knew. Or maybe it was simply realizing that if he gave up, everyone who came after him would face the same choice, and they might not be strong enough to resist. He burned the papers in the same fire where he cooked his dinner. Then he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He started inviting the inspectors to stay overnight. He told them to come see how they lived, to eat food cooked over flame, sleep under hand-hewn beams, and wake to birdsong instead of alarms. Some came out of curiosity. Others came to find more violations. But a few left understanding something they couldn't put in their reports. That maybe, just maybe, Conway wasn't the one living dangerously. The weight of unspoken truths. What visitors never knew. Something changed in Conway during filming sessions. He'd be explaining how to track deer, then suddenly stop mid-sentence. His head tilted like he was listening to something far away. When crew members asked what he heard, he'd just shake his head and continue. But his eyes would stay focused on something beyond the cameras, beyond the trees, beyond what anyone else could perceive. The journals were another mystery. Conway kept them locked in a chest made from a lightning-struck oak. Not even his apprentices knew what filled those pages. Some mornings, visitors would find him already awake, writing by candlelight, his pen moving across the page like he was racing against time. If anyone approached, he'd close the book and slide it under his coat. He'd claim he was just keeping track of things, but his eyes suggested something else entirely. Then there were the disappearances. Conway would vanish into the forest for days without warning or explanation. No supplies except what he wore. No word about where he was going. His apprentices learned not to worry after the first few times. He'd always return, usually at dawn, carrying that same notebook and looking like he'd been having conversations with ghosts. The changes to Turtle Island happened so gradually that most visitors never noticed. But those who returned year after year saw the pattern. Certain trails were redirected. Specific groves became off-limits. A meadow where students once camped was suddenly fenced with hand-split rails, and a simple sign noting that healing was in progress. When asked, Conway would only say the land needed privacy. His friend Marcus, who'd known him for 20 years, once found Conway moving his tool shed for the third time that summer. Marcus asked what he was looking for. Conway paused, sweat running down his face despite the cool mountain air. He said he wasn't looking for something but making room for it. When pressed about what it was, Conway just pointed to the empty space where the shed had been and explained that sometimes the land tells you where things need to be, and you just have to listen long enough to hear it. The production crew from Mountain Men had their own theories. Some thought Conway was documenting environmental changes, creating a record of how the mountain was transforming. Others believed he was mapping something underground, maybe water sources or mineral deposits. But the camera operator who'd worked with him longest had a different idea. She said one evening that he wasn't studying the land but having a conversation with it, and whatever it was telling him, he didn't want them to know. There was the matter of the restricted zones. 3 areas on Turtle Island where no one was allowed. Not students, not film crews, not even his closest friends. The first was a grove of ancient hemlocks that Conway said were older than the country itself. The second was a spring that bubbled up from rocks that looked deliberately arranged. The third was a clearing where nothing grew, despite the rich soil everywhere else. When a new apprentice accidentally wandered into the hemlock grove, Conway didn't yell. He just looked at the young man with such sadness that the student never went near those areas again. Visitors often described feeling watched on Turtle Island, not by Conway or other people, but by something in the landscape itself. The trees seemed to lean in when conversations grew quiet. Birds would go silent when certain topics came up, and everyone who stayed long enough reported the same dream: walking through the forest at night, following a light that led to Conway standing in one of the restricted areas, speaking to someone they couldn't see. Blood and sacrifice, the friends who never made it out. The first death happened in 1989, just 2 years after Conway bought the land. Tommy Fitzgerald had driven down from Pennsylvania to help raise the main lodge. He was 23, strong as an oak, and believed in what Conway was building. The log that killed him weighed 800 pounds. It rolled wrong when they were positioning it for the wall. Conway heard the sound before he saw what happened. A wet crack that meant bones breaking inside a body. Tommy lived for 6 minutes, looking at the sky through the trees, telling Conway it wasn't his fault. Conway buried him on the property in a spot where the morning sun hits first. The authorities wanted the body moved to a proper cemetery. Conway refused. Tommy had come to Turtle Island to be part of something permanent. That's where he'd stay. Every morning for the next year, Conway would find himself standing at that grave, wondering if his dream was worth a human life. The second was Sarah Chen, a botanist from California who came to document the medicinal plants growing wild on the preserve. She knew these mountains, had hiked them since childhood. But February ice doesn't care what you know. She went to collect wintergreen near the creek and never came back. Conway searched for 3 days before he found her body at the bottom of a ravine, her notebook still clutched in her frozen hand. The last entry was about finding a rare orchid she'd been hunting for years. Then came the winter that took Marcus and David, 2 brothers from Tennessee. They'd insisted on staying through January to help Conway finish the workshop before spring students arrived. The storm came without warning. 60 inches of snow in 36 hours. The roof of the shelter where they slept couldn't hold that much weight. Conway dug them out with his bare hands, fingernails tearing off in the frozen wood. But mountain winters don't negotiate. Each death carved something out of Conway that never grew back. He'd walked the paths they'd helped him build, touching trees they'd touched, sitting in spaces where their laughter once lived. Visitors would sometimes find him talking quietly to empty air, having conversations with people only he could see. But the loss that haunted him most was Jacob Whitehorse, the Cherokee elder who'd taught Conway everything about reading the land. Jacob had lived on the adjacent property for 40 years, coming to Turtle Island every few days to share knowledge about plants, weather, and the old ways. One December morning, Jacob walked into the forest to gather pine needles for basket weaving. He never walked out. Conway searched for months. Rangers brought dogs. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the mountains. Nothing. It was like the forest had swallowed him whole. Years later, Conway told a student that sometimes he heard Jacob teaching him. He'd be working on something and suddenly remember exactly how Jacob had shown him to hold the knife, or which bark to harvest in spring, like Jacob was still there, just out of sight. The student asked if that brought comfort. Conway looked at the trees for a long moment before saying it reminded him that everyone who dies there becomes part of the teaching. The poison in paradise, nature's screaming warnings. Conway first noticed it in the spring water. The pool where he'd drunk every morning for 15 years suddenly tasted wrong. Not quite metallic, not quite chemical, but something that made his body reject it. He had it tested. The results showed trace amounts of industrial runoff from a factory 40 miles upstream. 40 miles. That's how far poison travels when nobody's watching. The trees started dying in 2018. Not the natural death that comes with age or storm, but something different. The oaks would brown from the inside out. The hickories dropped their bark in sheets. Trees that had stood for 200 years were gone in a single season. Conway counted them in his journal. 73 in the first year, 112 the second. By 2020, he stopped counting. The birds changed their patterns too. Warblers that had nested on Turtle Island every May since Conway arrived started showing up in March, before the insects they ate had hatched. The wild turkeys moved their roosting spots 3 times in 1 year. Cardinals sang at midnight. Owls hunted during the day. Everything was shifting, like nature's clock had been thrown downstairs. Conway documented it all in journals that filled an entire shelf. Temperature readings every dawn for 30 years. First frost dates, last frost dates. When specific flowers bloomed. When certain birds arrived and left. The patterns were clear to anyone willing to look. Spring came 2 weeks earlier than when he'd first arrived. Summer lasted a month longer. Winter barely existed some years. The storms were the most obvious change. Conway had weathered hundreds of mountain storms, knew their rhythms like his own heartbeat. But these new storms came from wrong directions, at wrong times, with wrong intensity. A tornado in November, ice storms in April, hurricane remnants that somehow gained strength instead of losing it as they moved inland. During one storm in 2021, he watched lightning strike the same tree 17 times in 10 minutes. The tree exploded into flame. Then the rain put it out, then lightning hit it again, like the sky was angry at that specific spot. Animal paths that had existed since before European settlement suddenly changed. The deer trail that crossed near his cabin moved 300 feet uphill. The bare roots shifted entirely to the north face of the mountain. Even the insects acted differently. Fireflies that once blinked in synchronization now flashed randomly, chaotically, desperately. Father's shadow, the wounds that built a mountain man. For 40 years, people assumed Conway fled to the mountains to escape modern life. The truth was more personal than that. Eustace Conway Sr. was the kind of man who checked his son's bed corners with a ruler. Military precision in a house that had never seen war. Just the daily battle between a father's expectations and a son's need to breathe. Young Eustace would wake at 5 a.m. to the sound of his father's voice, listing that day's failures before they'd even happened. Breakfast was eaten in silence except for corrections. Sit straighter, chew properly, stop fidgeting. The worst part wasn't the criticism. It was the moving target of approval. Eustace would master something. Carpentry, mathematics, horseback riding, only to have his father immediately raise the bar. His father would tell him that anyone could do it once, but he needed to show he could do it perfectly 1,000 times. So Eustace tried. He became the youngest person to hike the entire Appalachian Trail. His father asked why it took him so long. The forest didn't judge. That's what 12-year-old Eustace discovered during his first solo camping trip. The trees didn't care if his tent was pitched at perfect angles. The streams didn't demand he justify drinking from them. For the first time in his life, he could make a mistake without someone cataloging it for future reference. By 17, Conway wasn't running to something. He was running from the sound of his father's voice in his head, criticizing every breath. He'd wake in his teepee, 50 miles from the nearest road, and still hear disappointment in the wind. The anger ate at him like acid. He'd split wood until his hands bled, imagining each log was another criticism being broken apart. It took 10 years of isolation before the anger started to fade. Not through effort, but through exhaustion. You can only carry rage so long before your arms give out. Nature taught him what his father never could, that strength comes from bending, not breaking. Trees that survived mountain storms were the ones that could move with the wind. The forgiveness came suddenly, unexpectedly, while Conway was teaching a student to build a fire. The young man kept apologizing for doing it wrong. Conway heard his father's voice about to come out of his own mouth, stopped, and realized he'd become what he'd run from. That night he wrote his father a letter, not to send, just to burn. In it, he forgave the man who'd never asked for forgiveness. Not for his father's sake, but so Conway could finally stop carrying the weight of that judgment. The cost of that freedom was everything normal people built their lives around. No wife, because intimacy meant vulnerability. No children, because he couldn't risk becoming his father. Few lasting friendships, because letting people close meant they might see the scared 12-year-old still trying to pitch the perfect tent. Turtle Island became both his greatest achievement and his perfect hiding place. 1,000 acres where nobody could tell him he was doing it wrong. Mountain men and the camera's betrayal. The History Channel producers promised Conway they'd show the truth. That was 2011, and he believed them because he still thought television could teach something real. They said mountain men would help people understand what self-reliance actually meant. Not the Hollywood version with dramatic music and fake danger, but the quiet daily work of living with the land instead of against it. Conway should have known better when they asked him to recreate chopping wood 3 times to get the right angle. Within weeks of the first episode, Turtle Island transformed into something Conway didn't recognize. Cars lined up on the dirt road every weekend. Strangers walked onto his property holding phones up, filming everything like they were at a zoo. A woman from New Jersey asked him to pose with her family next to a deer carcass he was processing. When he refused, she got angry, saying they'd driven 6 hours to see him, like Conway was a roadside attraction who owed her entertainment. The producers kept pushing for more drama. Could he look more concerned while starting a fire? Could he talk about danger more? One director actually asked if Conway could pretend to get lost on his own land. The director explained that people needed stakes. Conway stared at him for a long moment, saying the stakes were that they'd forgotten how to live without destroying everything they touched, and asking if that wasn't enough. The director said no. People needed an immediate threat, visible conflict, something they could fear from their couches. What the cameras captured wasn't Conway's life. It was a performance of his life, edited to fit between commercial breaks. They'd film him for 12 hours, then use 30 seconds where he looked most like their idea of a mountain man. The quiet moments teaching students about soil health got cut. The hours spent maintaining tools stayed on the editing room floor. Instead, viewers saw him wrestling logs and talking about survival like he was constantly one mistake from death. The real violation came when fans started treating Turtle Island like public property. They'd walk into his workshop while he was teaching, wanting selfies. They'd interrupt sacred moments, like the Cherokee blessing ceremonies he'd learned from Jacob Whitehorse, because they recognized him from TV. One man actually walked into Conway's cabin while he was sleeping, wanting to see how a mountain man really lived. Conway said later that he became a character in his own life. The person on screen wore his face but wasn't him. That Conway never struggled with loneliness, never admitted exhaustion, never showed the 10,000 small maintenances that actually kept Turtle Island running. Television Conway was invincible. Real Conway was a 50-year-old man whose knees hurt from decades of physical labor and whose heart broke a little more each time someone missed the point entirely. The 2024 confession. Conway chose a morning in early January to finally say what he'd been holding back for 40 years. No cameras from Hollywood, just a single documentary filmmaker who'd been visiting Turtle Island since childhood. They sat on handmade benches while frost melted off the cabin roof, and Conway started talking like a dam had finally broken. He began by saying that people thought he ran away from society because he hated it. His hands wrapped around a cup of pine needle tea. The truth, he said, was harder to explain. He was trying to save it. He talked for 6 hours straight, barely pausing except to add wood to the fire. He explained how a Cherokee elder named Joseph Standing Bear had told him the old story when he was 19, how the world rests on a great turtle's back, and humans had forgotten they were passengers, not owners. That story haunted Conway until he understood what he needed to do. Not just live in nature, but create proof that humans could exist without destroying it. Every structure on Turtle Island was an experiment in building shelter that improved the land instead of scarring it, in teaching modern people skills their great-grandparents considered basic, in helping someone raised on packaged food understand that a deer's death could be sacred if done with respect. For 30 years, Conway had been documenting the experiment in journals that filled 3 shelves: temperature readings, rainfall, animal sightings, and also human behavior. How long it took city people to stop checking for a phone signal. When students stopped complaining about the cold and started noticing bird calls. The moment someone realized they could create something with their hands that no store sold. The apprentices were the real experiment. Over 3,000 had come through Turtle Island since 1987. Most stayed a few weeks. Some remained for months. A few never really left, carrying Conway's teachings into schools, communities, and their own children's lives. Conway had letters from former students who'd started gardens, learned blacksmithing, taught their kids to see fire as a tool instead of mere destruction. They weren't living like him, but they were living differently because of him. Conway said that everything there was never about surviving nature, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. It was about remembering how to be human, real humans, not consumers, not viewers, not users, but people who understand they're part of something larger. He pulled out one of his journals, opened to a random page covered in observations about a single oak tree recorded across 20 years. He told the filmmaker that this was what paying attention looked like, what love looked like when you aimed it at the world instead of yourself. The Keepers, Secret Army for Earth's Future. Conway started choosing them in 2019, though he'd been watching for years before that. Not the loud ones who came for Instagram photos, not the ones who thought 3 weeks made them wilderness experts. He picked the quiet ones who stayed after dark to watch stars, the ones who asked about soil before asking about survival, the young people who understood that learning to tan a hide wasn't about the leather, but about respecting what died to keep you warm. He called them the Keepers, though never to their faces. There were 12 of them now, ages 16 to 28, from backgrounds that made no sense together except in Conway's mind. Maria, a former gang member from Chicago. David, who'd been headed for Harvard Medical School before something broke in him. Sarah, whose parents sent her to Turtle Island thinking it was rehab. Tom, who'd attempted on his life twice before finding Conway's teachings online. Conway taught them differently from the regular students. While others learned to start fires, the Keepers learned to read what different smoke colors meant. While others built basic shelters, the Keepers constructed buildings that could last generations. They learned the dangerous plants alongside the helpful ones, how to set bones, birth babies, and preserve food without refrigeration. But the real teaching went deeper. Conway showed them his journals, 30 years of watching the world change. He taught them to see patterns, how development upstream affected water years later. Why do certain birds disappear before others? Which plants moved uphill as temperatures rose? They weren't just learning to survive, they were learning to witness, document, and preserve knowledge that might matter when nobody else was paying attention. The book Conway was writing wasn't for the public, it was for them. 400 pages of everything he'd learned, written by hand because he didn't trust computers to last. How to read weather in tree bark, which mushrooms appeared after specific rainfall patterns, where to find medicine in plants that everyone else called weeds. He wrote at night, after the Keepers had gone to bed, racing against something he couldn't name, but felt approaching. One evening, as they watched sunset paint the mountains gold, he told Maria that he'd built this place to outlive him. But places don't survive, he said. Ideas do. People do. He gestured to the other Keepers working in the garden, their hands dark with soil, and said they aren't his students. They are his message in human form. That's all for the life of Eustace Conway. Don't miss the videos on screen now. They're just as interesting. Catch you in the next one.